Are we body-soul composites? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to The Philosopher's Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. According to Hylemorphism, all material objects are matter-form composites, where matter is the principle of potentiality in a thing, and it's what gets made to be the way that it is, and a form is the principle of actuality in the thing. It makes the thing be the way that it is. You could think of it as actualizing patterns of being. In this video, we're going to consider a hylomorphic view of mind. It would be very helpful for you to check out my video on hylomorphism, though, before you watch this video. One thing before we get started is interesting. So I told you to go watch that video, right? Interestingly, for hylomorphism, we don't start with philosophy of mind. We start with philosophy of nature, which makes the most sense because if you think about it, things with minds are just a subset of natural things, right? It's just one amongst many natural things. So it makes sense that there's a primacy there in philosophy of nature, and then philosophy of mind would be a specialized aspect of that, right? Specialized study in that. So we start with the philosophy of nature, and then we get into the philosophy of mind. As I said in the last video, if you plant an acorn, what do you expect is going to happen? You expect an oak is going to grow. You don't expect a penguin to pop up out of the ground, right? And what I meant by that example is that things change in these predictable patterns, right? They always change the same way. What is it about a thing that makes it change the same way? Whatever it is, Aristotle calls it a nature. And he points out that it must be part of the substantial form of the thing, right? The substantial form, remember, being that principle of the thing that makes it be what it is. So the matter is what gets made to be the way that it is, and the form is what makes it be that way. So the substantial form makes it be the kind of a thing that it is. So important to note that there are natures in Aristotle's philosophy. Now, fundamental particles, if this is right, also have natures. Right? Photons change in predictable ways. They act as waves and as particles, right? That's the big thing about them. But they don't act just as waves, right? They act as both. So there's predictability there. We know the way that they're going to act. We know the way they're not going to act. They're not going to act just like a wave by itself. So the fundamental particles in physics have a way that they act. They have natures. And one of the ways that their natures cause them to change is it causes them to organize themselves into elements like hydrogen and helium. And when it does so, the new elements that emerge have their own powers that the particles themselves don't have, which is interesting because that means that these new elements have their own natures, right? They have their own substantial form all of a sudden that just emerges from the original particles. And the natures of those elements are such that causes them to also organize themselves into certain ways. And one of those ways is into the kinds of things that can grow and reproduce and ingest nutrition. In other words, living things. And those powers, growing, ingesting nutrition, and reproducing, those are powers that the elements themselves don't have. So again, we have a new substantial form that emerges. Now, this substantial form that they now have, which makes them different than their parts, right? Their individual parts can't do this. The elements can't reproduce, can't take in nutrition or anything like that. So these new things have got a unique kind of substantial form, and this unique kind of substantial form that endues a thing with life, we'll call this a soul. Now, before you get upset, because I know some of you already are going to be like, wait a second, a soul? Who said soul? So the word soul in hylomorphism, at least right now, is not as dramatic as it is in common parlance. So right now, all it means is the form of a thing that is alive, right? The form of a living thing. And hopefully it makes sense as to why we would have to posit this substantial form in this case to explain life, because the individual parts here, again, don't have life. So if we could explain life by just pointing at the individual elements, then all things would be alive and we would never have any death. So that would be great. But They don't, right? It's not like that. So this new power that comes on, this new powers, I should say, that come on, the ability to reproduce, the ability to take in nutrition, and the ability to grow. Those three powers are evidence of a substantial form. Now, if all we have are those three powers, then what you have is a vegetative soul. You have basically a soul that plants have. And again, soul doesn't mean a ghost here, right? There's no ghost in the plant. That's not what we're talking about. We're just talking about the substantial form, the principle of the thing that makes it alive. That's all we mean. However, that's not the only kind of power that there can be in living things, right? Animals have the power of sensation. And that's a new thing, right? That's something that plants don't have. So a thing with the kind of form that allows it to sense things, we'll call that an animal soul. So notice what's going on here. The powers of life are not properties of the parts of the living thing. And yet the life of the thing depends on the parts. Does that sound like anything we've heard so far? Sounds just like emergentism, right? Except for emergentism is a mechanistic view of the world, so it lacks something that Hylemorphism has. Let's say you have a collection of particles. On emergentism, these are metaphysically simple kinds of things. So what you see is what you get. That's all that there is, right? The properties they have are the properties they have. And you take those and you arrange them into a brain shape. Now, according to emergentism, the next thing that happens is that a mind mystically just shows up out of nowhere. And the mind has nothing in common with the brain, right? There's nothing in common with the particles. It just shows up. Remember, the objection that we had there was that that's a brute fact, right? That just has no explanation whatsoever. Things are different on Hylemorphism because on Hylemorphism, those particles are not metaphysically simple. What we have is first prime matter that is substantially formed as particles. And then when you arrange it in a particular way, that new substantial form that you have is the substantial form of a thing that has a mind. And now it's in the nature of this new form to have sensations. And prime matter is the kind of stuff that is able to be alive and to be conscious. So no longer is it the case that you have two completely distinct things, right? The mind and the brain. Now instead, you have in the very nature of the thing itself, the ability to have a mind, to have sensations. And that's because the substantial form, although it is part of what makes a material thing, is not itself material. So it has the ability to have non-material sensations and also the ability to provide material structure to the brain. So this allows us to deal with a problem that plagued emergentism. It also allows us to deal with a problem that plagued physicalism in general, which is if you think about, consider a monkey that's looking at fire and it sees red and it feels heat, right? Is its brain red? Is its brain hot? No. How is it possible for that monkey to have these sensations and yet not be physically that way? On physicalism, all you have is the physical thing, so it's not possible. But on Hylemorphism, since the mind is that substantial form, it's that formal aspect of you, what can happen is you can have the form of the thing that you're perceiving exist in it in a material way, but also exist in you in a formal way, right? It can exist in your form, not in your material, right? But in your form. And Aristotle gives the example of it's like a signet ring in wax, right? Like if you've ever seen like a king has a ring and he dips it in the wax and then you could see its emblem on there, right? That would be like how the form of the thing is impressed upon your form so that you know the thing, so that you can sense that thing. So this explains how you can be qualitatively identical, right? Feeling the heat, perceiving the red, without being materially identical. It also explains the aboutness, right? The intentionality of a thought or a perception, right? What is my perception about? Well, it's about this form of the thing that I'm perceiving. Whereas if we're talking physicalism, there is no form of the thing that I'm perceiving. There's just the thing, the physical thing out there and the physical thing right here, and there's nothing in between. So it's interesting. Hylemorphism has answers for emergentist problems and for physicalist problems. So now we've talked about the vegetative soul and the animal soul. But so far, a unicellular organism has all the same powers as a human person. Growth, reproduction, ingesting nutrition and sensation. Does a human have anything in addition to this? Of course, the thing I'm thinking about here is thinking. Is human thought anything additional to what animals have? And by the way, it's okay with me if primates can think or dolphins can think, like I don't really care. I'm just saying, like, at the very least, is it the case that humans, the thoughts that go through humans' heads are different than, let's say, what a dust mite thinks? Is there a qualitative difference between a human mind and a dust mite mind? Well, first thing we should note is that it is true that thought requires sensation, which is what all animals have. So imagine a person who had never seen the color purple and is trying to picture a rainbow. What are they going to do to fill in that last slot? Roy G. Biv, what did they do for the V in the Roy G. Biv? Maybe seeing the color spectrum would give them some concept that there's a gap right there where the V should be. But how are they going to think up what goes in that gap, right? Like how would you think that? And now imagine you don't have any sensations, right? Imagine you're born without any ability to sense anything. What would you think about? Seems like you couldn't think about anything, right? Seems like you wouldn't have any thought at all. You wouldn't be sitting there thinking, wow, this is a boring life, because you wouldn't be thinking like, there's such a thing as life. You wouldn't know what boring is, right? There are all these things that you would not know. So sensation is necessary for thought. But let's say our thinker starts to think about triangles. And I'll throw a triangle up on the screen. Is this what it is to be a triangle? Is this what our thinker must think when our thinker thinks of triangles? No, because if this is what it meant to be a triangle, then all of these things could not be triangles. When you think of a triangle, you might picture an individual physical triangle. But there's also a way for you to think about a triangle that is an abstracted triangle, a universal triangle, one that doesn't have any specific kind of angle. Like in geometry, like we define a triangle as a three-sided shape. And we don't say, and by the way, it's got these angles or it's this long, right? We don't say that because we're talking about it in a universal sense. So we can think of things in this universal way. But when we're doing so, are we engaging with the physical in any way? No, we're abstracting from the physical. So although the brain is necessary for thinking, it's not sufficient for thinking. We can also think about universal things. And universal things are not physical. This means something kind of interesting for the human soul. So the human soul would be everything that you got in the animal soul plus the power of reason. And the reason this is interesting is it means that the human soul isn't necessarily a substance, right? Substance is something that can act independently. And we've already seen that in order to think, you need something to think about. So you need sensation. And yet, once you get the sensation, you can abstract from that sensation these universals, right? These universal concepts. And that is something that is non-physical, right? That's something that no physical thing can exist as, right? No physical triangle can be just a three-sided object. It has to be a specific number of angle degrees, and it has to be acute or obtuse or whatever it is. So since it can operate apart from the bodily organ, then Aristotle will call this a subsistent entity, not a substance, but a subsistent entity. It's a subsistent entity, and yet the human person is a body-soul composite. Right? So what you are is the body plus the soul, which is interesting because this gives a lot of responses to the specific Cartesian dualist problems that we saw. So, for example, there is no longer a problem of mind-body interaction because the mind and body are not separate substances. We don't have a problem of the body being just a tool because the body is not a tool. It's part of what you are. And also, like I think I said this in the Cartesian dualism video, we do have the issue of animals and plants having souls. However, it's not the same thing as the human soul. Instead, really, they are just a substantial form that causes a thing to live. That's it. So notice that Hylemorphism has answers for a lot of the problems that plagued other theories like dualism or emergentism and physicalism. And we could get even further into panpsychism, and I haven't talked about those answers it has. So this is another argument that we can have for Hylemorphism. It ends up explaining a lot of things that all the other theories can't. And this is, by the way, an argument I got from this book, Mind, Matter, and Nature, A Thomistic Proposal for the Philosophy of Mind by James Madden. Solid book, so check that out if you get a chance. One final objection that could be given: where does this leave the possibility for eternal life? I realize this isn't going to be a problem for everybody, but for some of you guys, I know you're going to be worried about it. So if we are body-soul composites, then once the soul leaves the body, that's it, right? You cease to exist. But that's not quite right. Remember that the soul is a subsistent entity. It's not a substance, right? The body and the soul together are the substance, but it is a subsistent entity since it has an operation independent of the body, which is the power of reason, right? The ability to abstract universals from particular instances. It must be able to exist independently. Since it can operate independently of the body, it must be able to exist independently of the body. Of course, it won't be a natural existence, right? The substance, what you are, is the body-soul composite. So although your identity would reside in the form, that's what makes you be the kind of thing that you are. So your identity would be retained. You wouldn't be the real you until you are back in a body. But this comports well with those religions, I'm thinking specifically of Christianity, that hold to a resurrection. So in Christianity, you die, you go to be with the Lord, and then at the end of the world, we all come back and we get resurrection bodies, and we live in a new heaven and a new earth. So it's not like we're floating around ghosts. We're not, we don't turn into angels, which is what some people think. And we don't have, halos and play harps or anything like that. We're actually supposed to be physical beings. But exactly what that looks like, of course, is a topic for a non-philosophical video. So that's the Hylemorphic theory of mind. If you have any questions, please hit me up in the comments. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and to share this video. And go in the store and buy some merch. And I will see you in the next video. Adios.